On the 18th of June 1948, the U.S. National Security Council launched the Office of Policy Coordination, or OPC, on the recommendation of State Department advisor and Long Telegram author George Kennan. The OPC was a covert operations unit with a mission to set up stay-behind networks in Europe. In other words, to create in advance a resistance and intelligence force to slow down and harass a potential Soviet invasion. The whole operation became commonly known as Gladio, after the name given to the Italian stay-behind network. In previous episodes of our Gladio series, we have learned about the foundation of these secret networks in NATO member states, as well as neutral countries such as Switzerland. I'm your host David, and today we are going to look at some of the operational details of these networks. For example, what was the role of military stay-behind units compared to the function of stay-behind organizations recruited amongst civilians. We will also learn about their recruitment and training practices. This is the Cold War. The most likely scenario for a Warsaw Pact invasion was an attack across the east-west German border, either across the North German Plain or through the Fulda Gap. NATO defensive plans in the early 1950s included provision for the bulk of its forces to fall back to the west bank of the Rhine River. A smaller contingent would be left behind to stay and aggressively delay the advance of enemy forces. These were the so-called stay-behind units, or SBUs. Initially, their backbone consisted of the British 21st and 23rd Special Air Service, or SAS regiments, as well as the US 10th Special Forces Group. In the 1960s, they were augmented by the SRS, the Special Reconnaissance Squadron of the Royal Armoured Corps. These SBUs had a dual role. At a tactical level, they had to provide intelligence on troop movements, and when given the occasion, they could ambush and demolish enemy troops or installations. But primarily, they were to acquire targets for NATO missiles and heavy artillery systems. This would have likely included the use of tactical nuclear weapons in order to slow or halt the advance of East Bloc forces. At a more strategic level, they were to organize and assist resistance movements in occupied territory. This task was to be accomplished with the support of networks that had been recruited from among the civilian population, the so-called stay-behind organizations, or SBOs. Now, importantly, while the actions of the SBUs were directed at NATO level, since they were military units, SBOs were to remain under national command. Each country retained control over their own SBO network. However, to ensure some degree of cohesion, NATO's Supreme Headquarters Allied Powers Europe, SHAPE, created a supranational body in 1952 to coordinate activities between both SBUs and SBOs. This was the Clandestine Planning Committee, or CPC. Further to this, in 1976, the Allied Coordination Committee, the ACC, was set up to bring national SBOs together. But, and there's always a but, the ACC only had responsibility for classical military activities conducted by SBOs, things like slowing down the enemy's advance and rescuing downed NATO pilots. Any other internal activity carried out by an SBO was directed at national level. This may seem like a rather boring administrative detail, but it becomes incredibly important in future debates and discussions over whether some SBOs were involved in state terrorism or if they were acting on orders from NATO. Much more detail on that in a future episode. Make sure you're subscribed and have done whatever it is we're asking you to do to the bell button this week, just so you don't miss it. Okay, so we've clarified that SBUs were professional, highly skilled military units. SBOs, on the other hand, were civilians, but they still had to be trained to a high level of proficiency. Their training programs were, and are, kept secret. However, the Swiss and Italian SBOs were the object of extensive parliamentary inquiries, which revealed interesting details on their recruitment, types of training they underwent, as well as the equipment they were trained to use. So let's look first at the Swiss SBO, known as P-26, which recruited approximately 400 members in total, both civilians and active military personnel. Once selected, small groups of them were flown to the UK to be trained by SAS instructors. The first course took place in December of 1967. Recruits learned how to conduct meetings in secret, how to collect intelligence and relay it via concealed radio equipment. They practiced how to take charge of a person wanted by Soviet authorities, and then how to exfiltrate them beyond Swiss borders, like a reverse Sound of Music, I guess, but with less singing. Finally, they trained extensively in instinctive shooting, close-quarter combat, and the use of explosives to sabotage and demolish enemy targets, just like the Sound of Music. After 1972, SAS and MI6 organized specialized exercises, codenamed Targum, to test the P-26 capabilities to infiltrate, evade surveillance, and to conduct sabotage operations. Trainees had to travel to Britain in two groups, one by plane, the other by rail and ferry. Once regrouped in London, they relocated to a countryside location and awaited instructions. From there, the adventure would really begin, one that involved transferring secret messages via dead drop, sabotaging an oil refinery, and evading police controls. Apparently, the police were in on it. They had to pretend the Swiss agents were drug dealers so they could search them and even incarcerate them for some hours. Targum involved a spectacular moment in which trainees had to jump from a low-flying helicopter onto the deck of a fast-moving boat, and even at one point onto a surfaced submarine. Similar exercises were held annually, and participating groups always included at least one female recruit. But before anybody thinks that this was any sort of sign of gender equality, we should look at that a bit closer. According to Magistrate Pierre Cornu, in 1979, the head of training for the Secret Services snuck his ami into one of the courses. Ami in French may be interpreted either as friend or, well, mistress. In 1982, a female secretary was enrolled with no previous experience in covert operations. Apparently, she suffered from mental health issues after the exercise. Clearly, some selections were made based on other criteria. As I said, not a sign of gender equality. When it comes to Gladio, the actual name of the Italian SBO, we have even more details on their curriculum. The selection of recruits was carried out by the military secret services. Criteria appeared contradictory as reported by different sources. Sometimes recruiters seemed to prefer middle-aged, low-key individuals, sometimes even disabled citizens. They were less likely to be arrested or deported into forced labor camps by Soviet invaders. Which makes sense. We talked about similar selection criteria in our episode on Operation Washtub, the US SBO set up in Alaska. But evidence shows that they also recruited fit, politically active 20-somethings and even former resistance fighters with extensive experience of guerrilla warfare in alpine terrain, which also makes sense. In all cases, all sources agree on one point. Recruits with extremist political views, both far right or far left, or with excessive gung-ho attitudes, were eventually excluded from the network, which makes sense. We know that 622 civilians were recruited between 1956 and 1990, colloquially known as gladiators. If you were selected for training, you would be instructed to travel to a major train station, for example, Rome Termini, holding a copy of some obscure local newspaper. From there, you get a tap on the shoulder, and you're taken to the barracks in Cerveteri, just north of Rome. After enduring a patriotic speech and signing declarations and insurance waivers, you fly via helicopter to the military airport in Ciampino, south of Rome. A C-47 Dakota, codenamed Argo 16, is waiting for you, and after a flight of about an hour, time for a short drive in a windowless van, and you finally reach your destination. You have no idea where you are, of course, but I'm going to tell you. This is the Training Center for Saboteurs, or CAG in its Italian acronym, at Torre Pollina, some kilometers south of Alghero in Sardinia. The CAG offered 5 modules: the collection and transmission of intelligence, sabotage, counter-propaganda against invaders, exfiltration of targets including NATO pilots downed over Italian soil, and guerrilla warfare. Most recruits specialized in one of these activities, taking part in dedicated exercises. Exfiltrators, for example, had to practice escape routes through the Alps so they could deliver their packages to France or Switzerland. Guerrilla warfare experts participated in field exercises such as Altanea 74. In this simulation, US Navy SEALs linked up with their Italian counterparts infiltrated enemy lines and then conducted guerrilla actions alongside gladiators in the northeast of the country. Finally, the sabotage experts could train on the CAG's own obstacle course. Here, gladiators had to swing on ropes, crawl under barbed wire, and climb on walls topped with shards of glass. They would then infiltrate reconstructions of various sites, including power stations or other military objectives, which they then planted with explosives. Regardless of their specialization, all gladiators learned one vital skill: how to independently recruit and coordinate their own small partisan network, which could spring into action once the Red Army came knocking at the Alps. Such intense training required members to take frequent leave from their workplace and homes. In the mid-1970s, one of the earliest recruits raised the question: how can we continue to justify this absence to our wives? The same gladiator came up with the solution by recruiting his own wife in 1976. In his own words, she owned a hair salon. She then became the best at instinctive shooting. So there you have it. Glamorous hairstylist by day, Soviet fighting gunslinger by night. If HBO is interested in the miniseries, well, you know where to find me. And if they need a theme song for the show, how about borrowing some lines from the official prayer of the Gladio volunteers? We are alert sentries in the difficult task we have received. Help us, O Lord, in foiling our enemies' dark threats, the schemes and machinations of their acolytes. If we are to spill blood, let it be a seed of light and hope. That's our translation, by the way. So that prayer may have been unique to Italy, but one thing in common to all SBUs and SBOs was the access to strategically placed caches of weapons and equipment. Stay-behind units stationed in West Germany could even boast of sophisticated prefab modular shelters. They were equipped with periscopes to spy on enemy movements and equipped with field radios, usually RS-6, MK-123, or MK-128 varieties. The shelters also contained 9mm handguns, knives, tank and aircraft recognition manuals, and a copy of Total Resistance, a guerrilla warfare manual by Swiss Major Hans von Dach. To top it all off, some essentials to help ease the long nights in hiding were also included: brandy and chocolate. The caches used by Gladio were known as nascos, short for the Italian word for hiding place, nascondiglio. 139 of them had been planted across the Italian peninsula, with the vast majority in the northeast. Each nasco typically stored submachine guns, sniper rifles, 9mm and 22 handguns, as well as hand grenades, knives, field radios, and binoculars. An inventory compiled in 1963 also mentioned phosphorus bombs, explosive mortars, and even some 57mm field guns. Now that's a spicy meatball. Now, in 1972, a nasco was accidentally discovered in Arusina, near Trieste. The SID, that's military intelligence, took the decision to close down all the caches. Light weapons were given to police stations for safekeeping, while explosives and artillery weapons were sent to the CAG in Sardinia. However, a senatorial commission suspected that some of the Orosina explosives had been used by a right-wing terrorist to kill 3 carabinieri, that's Italian gendarme, policemen, on the 31st of May, 1972. This became known as the Massacre of Peteano, one of the events which casts a shadow of controversy over the SBOs. Were Gladio and other SBOs involved in illicit violent activities? Did they commit acts of state-sponsored terrorism and false flag attacks? Were they specifically trained to attack a local communist party in case they seized power via elections or otherwise? In his report on P26, Swiss judge Pierre Cornu mentions an exercise taking place after 1979. Officially, it was about simulating acts of sabotage against an invader, but one of the participants testified that it was more about fighting an extremist government which had gained power in the country. Cornu also writes, "The elements gathered during the inquiry allows to state that in certain countries, redacted, resistance organizations would have probably sprang into action not only in case of a foreign occupation, but also in case of the Communist Party or a similar political force gaining power." Similarly, a report published in October of 1995 by the Italian Parliament refers to a military intelligence document dated the 1st of June 1959. According to this source, SBOs were intended as resistance movements against, quote, aggression from the East and apparently in the eventuality of internal subversion. We can conclude that at least some SBOs were sanctioned and trained to act against internal enemies, not just the Warsaw Pact. But did these intentions materialize into practice? And how? Well, I'll leave it on a cliffhanger for today. We will address the final elephant in the NASCO in our last installment on the Stay Behind networks. My thanks to Arnaldo Teodorani for his research work on today's episode, and to make sure you don't miss all of our future episodes, please make sure you subscribe to our channel and have protected the bell button with a network of operatives who will help to arrange and exfiltrate the bell button to a submarine waiting off the coast. Artillery support may be required, so recite your Gladio prayer. We can be reached via email at thecoldwarchannel@gmail.com, and we're active on Facebook and Instagram at thecoldwartv. If you enjoy our work, please consider supporting us via www.patreon.com/thecoldwar or through YouTube membership. And don't forget, the trouble with the Cold War is that it doesn't take too long before it gets heated.